to begin by talking about Deuteronomy, and as you may know, there's a lot of discussion with Deuteronomy about whether it is a suzerain vassal treaty or exactly what it is. The suzerain vassal treaty was characterized by several parts that were typical of it. For example, and they argue that Deuteronomy follows this pattern. Suzerain vassal treaties had a historical prologue that usually detailed the relationship between the suzerain and his vassal, the higher king and the new subject who's coming under his protection. And so naturally they point to Deuteronomy. The first few chapters goes over the history of God's dealings with Israel from out of Egypt until that point in time. They say, see, it matches. Then in the suzerain vassal treaty, the historical prologue was always followed by a set of basic stipulations. And it was usually in the form of apodictic laws. You shall not, much like the Ten Commandments. And so here, in chapters 4, basically 4 through 11 in Deuteronomy, they point out that you have the same kind of basic laws. Then, following the basic stipulations, you would have detailed stipulations. If you do this, then this will happen. If you do this, then this will happen. If you do this, then this. And we call those casuistic laws, the cause and effect. And so they would argue that chapters 12 through 26 are all casuistic laws in Deuteronomy, and they point that out. And it's true. They go through it and says, if you commit this crime, then you'll suffer this penalty. Following the detailed stipulations, the suzerain vassal treaties then would have some kind of a document clause, as they call it, where it says keep this thing and read it every so often, whatever. And you have something similar to that in chapter 27, where he has the commandment for them to, on a every 7th year basis, read the law and go through the blessings and the curses on Mount Gerizim and Ebal. So you have a similar thing. Then there'll be blessings and curses in the suzerain vassal treaty. In other words, if you keep the treaty, here's the things I, as your sovereign, will do for you. If you don't, here are the things I'll do for you or do to you. And so you have in Deuteronomy chapter 28, you have a series of blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. So you have the same pattern. And then suzerain vassal treaties usually had some kind of recapitulation of everything that was said at the end. And they say, well, you got the same thing, Deuteronomy chapters 29 and 30, with the land promises. So they've drawn parallels between the classic suzerain vassal treaty and said, Deuteronomy is really just a suzerain vassal treaty. God the suzerain, Israel the vassal. My problem with this view is that Deuteronomy makes it very clear you got 3 sermons. Because he identifies at the beginning point of each one where he was when he gave the message. And they are 3 separate messages. Now that doesn't mean that they weren't put in that order. But it's less likely that on 3 different occasions he's given you bits and pieces of a suzerain vassal treaty. Of course, some scholars will say, well, yeah, but it was edited to end up that way. But I don't see it that. I think literally it's more 3 sermons, 3 things he had to say, and it's coincidental. In fact, it's maybe we might say they're squeezing everything into a suzerain vassal box, but it's not really there. Now, what I see as the key theme in Deuteronomy, and the main idea, if you want to summarize it into one dominant theme, is covenantal faithfulness. And it's interesting because it's their need to be faithful to the covenant and the promise that God will be faithful to the covenant. And here's the problem that Israel ended up with. God was faithful to the covenant. And he liked that saying that we have. All the promises of the Bible are mine. Of course, the problem is in Deuteronomy, a lot of them are negative promises. If you do this thing wrong, then I will do this to you. And God kept all those promises, along with the promises to bless. He had promises for physical blessing as well as physical punishment, or what we would call corporal punishment of a nation if it was disobedient. physical blessing of the nation if it was obedient. Now, where it becomes difficult is often in our preaching, we have a tendency then to translate that into the New Testament. But one of the things that we have in Deuteronomy is a contract, if you want to call it that, a constitution of a nation, an agreement between God and His group of people that included physical blessings. In the New Testament, we don't have those same promises. When you go through the New Testament, there's promises of spiritual blessings, there's promises of persecutions, and there's promises of eternal blessings and rewards. Jesus said, I'll reward you 100 times over in the next life. You know, there are those kinds of promises, but there's not the promise that if you do this, if you do A, then B will happen, especially monetarily. And that's where prosperity theology goes wrong. Because, or even much of our sincere preaching, I've heard sermons where they go to Malachi and they say, bring your tithe into the storehouse and God will bless. And they give testimonies about this person who began tithing, and after they began tithing, God blessed them and they got rich and all this kind of stuff. Or their bills were paid, or you know, all their problems went away, and all these kind of good stories. And they're nice anecdotal stories, but what was said in Malachi was on the basis of promises made by God to them in Deuteronomy. And he's really saying God will keep His promises if you'll keep your end of the covenant. So it's very different from ours. But covenantal faithfulness, that's the thrust of it. Now notice again, the message of Deuteronomy, which I gave you in the handout, is that Israel's call to covenantal faithfulness brings blessing rather than punishment from God on the basis of His covenant. The whole point of Deuteronomy is, here's the covenant. Here's how we're going to do it. And if you'll trust me and you'll respond in obedience, I'll take care of you. But if you don't, here are the consequences. And I would say this, Deuteronomy chapter 28, 29, 30, when you get down through there and he says, if this happens, then this will happen, if this happens, then this happens, that's their history. God was really telling them what's going to happen over the next 500 years. That's really what went on there. He basically detailed their history. Not in the sense of, okay, let me tell you what it's going to be like, but in the sense of, here's what it will be like if you don't catch on. And of course they never did. So, we have it. Now, broad outline of Deuteronomy, this is how I would outline it. I see chapters 1 through 30 as 3 sermons. Chapters 1 through 4 is what God has done. It's a sermon about what God had accomplished up to that point and bringing them to Himself. Chapters 5 to 26 is what God expects. And He goes through, again, it includes all the different covenantal stipulations. It includes both the apodictic laws and the casuistic laws. But it's God telling them, Moses repeating to them. He began by repeating the 10 Commandments. But then he goes through and says, these are the things that God expects of you as His covenant people. And then in chapters 27 through 30 is what God will do. Both either to bless or to curse. Now that you know His expectations, here's what He promises you. And again, He kept it. The last 4 chapters, 31 to 34, are a historical appendix, possibly put there by Joshua, because it recounts Moses' death. So it's very unlikely that Moses wrote it. But Joshua was his amanuensis. He would have recorded everything for him anyway, and then Joshua is a prophet in and of his own right, and so he would have done it. Deuteronomy doesn't have a whole lot of action, so you don't have key players, key events, things like that, other than the commissioning of Joshua and the death of Moses. You do have those events in the book of Deuteronomy at the very end, where Joshua replaces Moses. And I find it fascinating to think about this, that, for 40 years Joshua was his gopher, but he was also the guy, like we noticed last time, who was sitting in the tent listening to Moses and God talk. And Moses leaves and Joshua stays. You know why he stayed? He hadn't finished writing down his notes. Wait, got one more thing. Yeah, so, but let's look at it. We begin in the first 4 chapters, the first 3 chapters, with the historical review in Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is extensive enough. We can't go chapter by chapter, but I do want to highlight some things. And here you have a recounting of their movements and of God's dealings all the way through the conquest of Sihon and Og's kingdoms. And the whole point of this passage, I believe, is to show them, God has been with you. Now, you've had your problems, you've had your sins, but God has been with you, and He's brought you to this point where you're on the border of the land, you're poised to be able to cross into the land that He promised you. And we know from Numbers, they've done their census, they've confirmed that the whole previous generation is dead except for Joshua and Caleb, and that the next generation is ready to go, and they need to be reminded that God brought them there. Now remember, most of these have grown up in that environment. They were all under 20 when this thing began. They were youths or kids. The vast majority have been born during that time. So they don't remember all of Egypt, and many of them don't remember the first few years. And so they're reminded of that. Now, you have an interesting pause, because after He calls on them to remember, and that's one of the sub-themes in Deuteronomy. They need to remember. They need to remember what God has done. He warns them that when they fell into idolatry, they got punished. And they're in danger when they go into the promised land of falling into idolatry again. And if they go into the promised land and repeat that mistake, that they will eventually be cast out of the promised land. Already the warnings, not just in chapters 28 through 30 is he saying this, but at the very beginning He reminds them, you haven't learned your lesson yet, and if you don't learn your lesson and you repeat this error, it's going to cost you living in the land. You're about to cross into the land and conquer it, but there's no guarantee you get to stay there unless you stay faithful. And so, that's the warning He leaves them with in His first sermon. Now there's this little pause where He talks about the 3 cities of refuge. And they set aside 3 cities on the east bank as cities of refuge. Eventually they will have 6 cities. Again, if you look at a map, these 6 cities are positioned such that anywhere in the country, if something happens, you're within 20 miles of a city of refuge. So you're within 4 or 5 hours running to get there on foot. So He positioned them so that the innocent manslayer could get there without having to worry about being killed before he could arrive. So we do that. From that, then we move on to the second sermon, again, what God expects. In chapter 5, He goes over the 10 Commandments. Now, if you notice that His review of the 10 Commandments are not word for word what the original 10 Commandments were, because He didn't say it word for word. I believe this is a good, honest, accurate recounting of the message He gave, and He paraphrased it when He was speaking to the nation. But it's the same 10 Commandments. And again, how many of them are we under?
9.
9 and 10. 9 and 10. The only one that has not repeated that we should obey in the New Testament is the Sabbath command. And again, why? Because the Sabbath was the seal of the covenant under the Mosaic covenant. It was a sign of loyalty to the Mosaic covenant, and we're not under the Mosaic covenant, so we don't have to keep that. Now, chapter 6 has the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, the classic thing. And the Israelites recited that 3 times a day. Jesus recited that 3 times a day, probably till the day He was crucified. He grew up reciting it, and I would expect that He recited it 3 times a day at each meal. And when He got up, lunch, dinner, whatever, that He recited it 3 times a day until His resurrection, or until His crucifixion. And
did they recite the verse, or was it a prayer about the verse, or was it word for word?
I believe it was word for word. I think it was word for word that they would quote it. And I don't know that it was a part of their prayers, but I don't know that it was a prayer. But it was something that they would recite. Whether you were a rabid Pharisee or you were just a common person, all the Israelites recited it. This is something that was just a standard part of their